to welcome you all to our session today on equity of access. I'm really excited to have our three speakers here today, but before I introduce them, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So we are in Zoom, and if you haven't found it already, the chat is at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on that and chat away. It's always great when people chat during these sessions. Ask questions. I'll keep track of the questions for our speakers. So ask questions, put your comments in, what you're thinking related to the chat, related to the topic, of course. That would be great. If you see the chat attached to your window and you would like it to be detached so you can move it around, click on the down arrow to the left at the top, and you can pop out. Click on pop out, and then you will have it popped out. We will have three speakers today, and I'm going to introduce each one, and then I will share the screen again, and we'll get started with the presentation. So today's topic is about doing away with fines and fees for equity of access. I know you phrase it differently. That's how I'm phrasing it for the moment. And our three speakers are Stephanie Myers, Meg DePriest, and Beth Christ. And here we go, sorry. Meg is gonna be first in the bios, is currently a consultant working with the California State Library. She served as grant coordinator for Colorado State Library's SPELL project, which enabled 8 public libraries throughout the state to develop innovative early literacy programs. And she wrote the white paper for CSL advocating for the elimination of fines and fees on children's materials. And Steph Myers is the patron services supervisor at the Carbon Valley Regional Library within the High Plains Library District in Weld County, Colorado. She was directly involved with the district's effort to eliminate fines in 2015. And prior to that, she spent a decade as the adult services librarian at the Erie Community Library, also a part of HPLD. And Beth Christ is the Youth and Family Services Coordinator at the Colorado State Library. She supports youth services staff in public libraries across Colorado, and she supports children, teens, and families by coordinating statewide initiatives for early literacy, summer learning, outdoor experiences. Summer learning, outdoor experiences, and other campaigns. I like summer learning, outdoor experiences. I think that makes sense. And she's passionate about finding and removing barriers to library services, including overdue fines. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to get your slides back again, and Trio, you are on.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting us today, Linda, to present this to the YALSA group. It is very exciting. I am a YALSA member myself, so this is really a thrill and such an important topic, and we're really glad to share it with the YALSA members today. So we're going to start here. This is a great graphic. This is actually from the Hillsborough County Public Library Cooperative in Florida. I love it. It's just so simple. Just bring it back. No more late fines. And that's what this whole presentation is about. So we'll start there with the next slide. We have a great story from a teen services librarian in Pikes Peak Library District, which is in Colorado. You can go ahead and read that. Quite a powerful story, right? And as the story demonstrates, late fines can create a really significant barrier to using the libraries for some teens, often those that need access to libraries and reading materials the most. Fines most deeply impact teens in low-income households who may lack transportation to return materials to the library, and paying fines, which can add up really quickly, can be challenging for families with a tight budget. Some teens don't check out materials at the library as they know they might not be able to come back to return them on time, and some have blocked library cards due to accumulated fines and fees they can't afford to pay. And being blocked from library services can also cause a lot of embarrassment and shame for some teens, and they might even stop using the library forever because of those bad experiences that they had at the library. And if you click to the next slide, Linda. Thank you. This is a
Hey
great,
ladies, I'm sorry, really quick. We have a couple of people who are having trouble hearing us.
oh, thank you.
So Ann Wilson and Lori Caskey-Sigety. I hope I said that right. I'm sorry if I butchered it. Are you still unable to hear? Well, I guess you won't be able to hear if you we should text them.
I'll put it in the chat. So let me see if, so did that how you found out? Did they chat you?
Yes, it was in the chat.
Huh, I'm not seeing that chat. I'm just gonna type, can everyone hear? Go, I think Beth, I'll keep doing that. Oh, got it to work, go. Go ahead,
Okay,
Beth.
great. Okay, well, thank you. And thanks, Steph. I didn't notice the chat, but yeah, great. And definitely if you have any technical issues during this, just jump in on the chat as you've been doing, that's great. And here's another quote. And this one's from the St. Paul Public Library in Minnesota. And you can see from this quote how well this addresses the issue of overdue, or how the topic of overdue fines fits directly into content area 8 of YALSA's teen competencies, equity of access, which is of course the title of this presentation. And that reads, ensuring access to a wide variety of library resources, services, and activities for and with all teens, especially those facing challenges to access. So librarians have so thoughtfully provided these amazing collections for YA materials and programs for teens. And if the teens can't use those great collections and services, then it's really not an equitable service. So unfortunately, while librarians encourage all teens to avail themselves of the collection, the policies of many libraries are actually doing the opposite. So we're going to walk you through for the rest of this how you can advocate up for your library to get rid of fines. So next slide. If your library does still charge overdue fines, you are by far not alone. You can see here, this is from a Library Journal study done last year in 2017. And this is from the Library Journal staff surveyed a random selection of public librarians, and there were 454 respondents, and you can see the responses here. So if your library is amongst these, you're not alone. However, since that survey, if you can flip to the next slide, there are so many libraries that have gone fine-free, which is so exciting. And going fine-free can be on at least children's materials. Some places start there, which is great, but this is really a movement now across the country, into Canada as well, and we are so excited that this continues to spread. And this is small communities, this is large communities. Here are just a very few examples of newspaper headlines and library graphics letting their public know that their library has gone fine-free on at least some materials. So very exciting. Definitely a trend toward more equitable library services that all libraries can join. If you click to the next slide, because there are so many libraries going fine-free, Meg has created this great list online. You can look on it. It's just a Google spreadsheet. And you can find libraries of a similar size to yours that have eliminated fines on at least some materials. And if your library is one of these and you're not on the list, you can always add your library name to it. So this is a huge and ever-growing list. We're really, really excited to keep track of them all. And the next slide. So now we're going to talk more about how you can advocate for this change in your library. If you still have fines on all materials or even some materials, as I said earlier, some libraries are going fine-free just on board and picture books or juvenile materials, and maybe you think your library is ready to spread that equitable service across the board, or at least up to YA materials. So if your library has not yet gone fine-free or just on juvenile materials, some things you can do is request a meeting with your library administration. And or alternately, you can prepare your case in written or digital form to present to your administration, which, depending on your situation, that might work better for you. And then you can begin by gathering statistics. So definitely find out how many teens are blocked because they have too many fines and fees. And then if you can, find out how much money is actually brought in by fines on YA materials. And what our research has shown is that generally, the total overall fines for for all library materials combined is less than 1% of a budget. So the fines on YA materials is a tiny fraction. So if you can, find that out and gather that material. And then definitely gather stories of impact. How are your teens in your community negatively impacted by fines? It's really, sometimes the stories can be more powerful than the statistics, but other people react better to the statistics. So it's great to have both. So if you can be gathering both the statistics and the stories. And another really important part of this is develop your talking points and debunk the myths around fines. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Meg.
Thanks, Beth. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So when you're getting ready for your meeting, it's good to have your ducks in a row and your talking points lined up. And I've lined them up for you here. So the first talking point is overdue fines don't work. The traditional, commonly held belief is that fines function to provide equal access to materials by encouraging patrons' sense of civic responsibility. If everyone turns their stuff in on time and they don't damage the library materials, people waiting in line can access them in a timely manner. This is an assumption that members of our community and our profession have held for decades and decades, and they're views you most certainly will encounter in your community, your governing entity, and maybe even among your colleagues. The Colorado State Library white paper advocating for the elimination of fines and fees on children's materials came about because we wanted to conduct a literature review and comb our profession's research to see if there are data to support the idea that fines affect borrowing behavior. And there aren't a lot of studies in the literature, but I found a few striking ones. In 3 surveys of North Carolina libraries conducted between 1983 and 1991, researchers compared circulation statistics of libraries with different overdue policies. This research revealed no significant difference in the overdue rates of libraries that charged overdue fines and those that didn't. And another surprising fact they found was that charging nominal fees did not affect the return rate of materials, but the existence of heavy fines did. So those nickels and dimes and quarters per day that libraries charge don't do a darn thing. If you really want your materials to come back promptly, you need to charge truly punitive fines, perhaps $5 a day. As diligent as these researchers were in 3 research projects over 15 years, they couldn't uncover data to support the assumption held in the profession that the existence of nominal late fines is a successful way to get patrons to return materials on time. And then this older data can be supplemented by more recent evidence. In the past few years, by monitoring the length of hold times before and after eliminating overdue fines, libraries have found that hold times have not increased when they ditched the fines. Salt Lake City Library hold times were practically unchanged. They went from 9.6 days to 9.8 days in the first 3 quarters after dropping all late return fines. And San Rafael Public Library in California reported no change in hold times in 3 years following the elimination of late fines on children's and teens materials. Another research study of an academic library that's worth noting is that they tried to see whether rewards rather than punitive fines could affect the timely return of materials. Even the presence of rewards like gift cards and such didn't influence the promptness or lack thereof of students in returning materials. What we have here is a policy that's existed for decades with no solid evidence that it actually works. When we run up against these old assumptions, it's good to have these data points up your sleeve. We'll provide you with information about where this data I just shared came from, and you can use them as you build your case. Next slide, our second talking point. It costs money to collect money. As Beth mentioned earlier, overdue fines usually make up a really small amount of a library's budget, typically less than 1%. And if you add to that the often overlooked costs required to collect those dimes and quarters, and the actual revenue generated is very small. Between staff time, mailing overdue notices, fees for processing credit card payments, the payments to collection agencies, it turns out that much less revenue is collected than it might appear. Some libraries that have carefully tracked revenue from fines before and after eliminating them have found that collecting fines is actually cost neutral or even cost more than the revenue coming in. And of course, there are other human costs associated with charging overdue fines. For many library staff members, the process of collecting and enforcing fines can prove stressful. The library journal Beth talked about earlier, in the survey, people indicated that they feel like there's enough conflict occurring in libraries without having to engage in this adversarial conversation with patrons. Library staff interested in eliminating overdue fines discussed the negative impression it leaves on users, and how it reinforces the stereotype of libraries and librarians being stern. You try so hard to remain welcoming to teens and relevant to their lives in pursuit of knowledge, and collecting overdue fines just doesn't help this relationship. The next slide, our third talking point, is fines can prevent borrowing. In a 2004 study examining the influence of school and public libraries on children's literacy skills, researchers found libraries in economically disadvantaged areas of the country had significantly lower circulation rates than middle-class neighborhoods. So using ethnographic research methods, including interviews and observations, they discovered many families in low-income areas did not own a library card, or if they did, family members were reluctant to check out books because they feared having to pay overdue fines. The traditional practice of charging late fines has left a lasting impression on the very people who most need libraries, community members, including teens who are economically disadvantaged. Our own research at the Colorado State Library revealed that parents in low-income households with young children identified library fines and fees as a barrier to them using the library fully. And we've had conversations with both teens and YA librarians indicating that fines accrued on a teen's account can lead to shame and embarrassment and fewer library visits. So the next slide, our fourth talking point, is ditching fines increases visits. Who knew? Libraries that have eliminated late fines have seen an increase in borrowing and new library card holders. Steph Myers from High Plains is going to talk to you about their experience. I'll just give you a sneak peek. They had 8% more borrowers after the policy change. San Rafael Public Library in Northern California went fine-free for children's materials in 2015, and Salt Lake City went fine-free for all materials in 2016. Both kept track of what happened in the first 3 quarters after their policy change. So at Salt Lake reported an almost 11% increase in checkouts, almost 11% increase in numbers of borrowers, and 3.6% more cards issued. And then Sarah Houghton at San Rafael reported this year that she received no guff from anyone about the policy change. Checkouts of children's materials went up each year after the policy change, and she reported a whopping 40% increase in juvenile borrowers. All this with no change in the rates of late returns. So if you decide to go fine-free, I strongly encourage you to reach out to libraries like Salt Lake and San Rafael and High Plains. Not only can they share their experience, but they can also provide you with the data like these that support your cause. And then our fifth talking point, next slide, it's a movement and you gotta join it. Beth talked about this earlier, but since becoming interested in this topic in 2015, we've eagerly watched this trend grow and grow. In trying to keep track of the news of library system after library system dropping overdue fines, I began this little Google document to keep track of all the news. And we invite you to visit it, where you can view different libraries' circulation policies. You can find links to local news articles covering the change. And of course, we hope you add to it as you succeed at your library and learn of others that do. So when I made this slide, it was 116 libraries and counting. That might have changed. I haven't checked my Google News lately. But these are just the ones we know about from news items that were released. I started this with just a Google alert. When you encounter a naysayer in your advocacy work, simply showing them how many libraries have ditched this policy and pointing to the local news stories we've gathered on this Google Doc can really help make your case and put the members of your governing body at ease about the change, and they'll realize they're in good company. So I'm gonna hand this over to Steph now, who's gonna talk about their experience at High Plains. And
actually, it'll come back to me.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Beth.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry, Steph.
That's okay.
I've got a few more slides and then we'll go over to Steph.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, we're going to turn back to advocacy now that you know how to gather your statistics and your talking points. We're going to talk more about what else you can do in terms of advocacy when you're talking to your administration and advocating for getting rid of fines. So the first thing is to create meaningful visuals. And either in print or in digital form, however you're presenting your materials, will really help you make your case in your presentations. Infographics can be powerful and succinct tools to help you make your case. And they don't need to be fancy or take a lot of software or a lot of skill. Instead, include photos, illustrations, and graphics that can interact with and amplify your message. We've got more examples on the next few slides, but there's one right here on this slide. And this is from the St. Paul, the Public Library in St. Paul, Minnesota. They did this great visual here on where there are more blocked cards, and you can see very clearly on their map that there are more blocked cards in economically challenged neighborhoods. So I thought that was really powerful visual that they created, and so you could do something like that. And again, we have more examples in the following couple slides. Another powerful way to get your advocacy in is to involve teens directly. Stories are, like I said before, they're such a compelling component of advocacy work. And if you encourage teens to represent their own interests directly to your library's administration, that can be the most powerful of all. If they're able to come to a meeting and with your administration and talk directly from their own experience, that can be really powerful. But if that's not possible, you can gather their quotes. You can perhaps get them on video or audio and play that in your meeting for your administration. That can also be powerful. And then honing your ask is really important too. Decide what it is that exactly you're asking for. Do you want to advocate to get rid of fines on all materials all at once, which is great. Perhaps you think, well, we've already had some pushback in this area. Maybe we should stick with juvenile and YA materials. Or you could go a similar route and talk about juvenile and YA cards. You could do either way. Other libraries, as Steph might mention later, get rid of fines on all materials except perhaps media. So that's another way to go, but make sure you know your ask up front and be specific. And also, some libraries do have the providing fine amnesty periods or other ways that patrons can reduce fines by reading a certain amount or volunteering at the library. But again, to get full equity here, those still aren't options for a lot of people. So we really encourage you to go full out fine-free on at least some materials all the time. And another ask that you could make that some libraries have done, and this is of course the best of all, is if you can wipe all the fines for YA materials and juvenile materials. So people come in with a completely clean slate. They don't have things hanging over them. They can just fully use the library right away and no fines going forward for those patrons. That is the best of all. But again, that could be a step two. If you think this is already going to be a hard sell, maybe that's for year two. Just things to consider. And again, it just is based on your own library and your own community. Another option for an ask is a pilot period. 6 or 12 months is common, and we know that libraries have done this. Usually it is successful and they continue to make, and they decide to make it permanent. But that is another way you can ask, especially if you're getting some pushback. Suggest that 1 year, 6 month or 1 year period to collect data along the way and see how it's working. So if you could switch to the next slide. Thank you. This is another great visual from the St. Paul Library in Minnesota. They have a great website all about getting rid of their fines. They've done so much work, and their visuals are really powerful. So this is a 2-page infographic. This is the first page of it. We'll leave it here for a few minutes, but all of it has some national research, some background information, local library statistics, and impact stories, all in this very nice, neat package. And so something like this can be really powerful, and it's also succinct, so that your administration, or if it goes up further, your board members don't have to read through a lengthy report. They can get it all in a nice visual. And can you switch to the next slide? We'll see the second page of this infographic, which is, it's similar. Again, it's the national information, it's the local information. It's a great mix of stories and statistics. So we'll leave it here for just a second, just for you to take a look. And of course, visuals can look all different ways. And this is just certainly one example of many ways you can go. Okay, we'll go ahead and switch to the next slide. This is an example of involving teens. Meg reached out to some libraries and to get information directly from teens for advocacy purposes. And this is just a great quote from Rhea B., a former teen patron. She's now 18. And she is from the Pikes Peak Library District. And so this is her story. You can read it. And again, very powerful, right? And if you presented this to administration, some, like I said before, some are really more moved by stories and this strong impact statement here. So the next slide is, what if it doesn't work? What if your best efforts don't work? Certainly ask why. There's no reason you can't ask why. And then you'll have a better idea when you come back later, because it's always great to come back later and try again. So you could consider changing your ask soon. So maybe if you're asking for the whole thing up front, get rid of all fines on all materials. Perhaps you could suggest a pilot period, or juvenile and YA materials or cards. So you could scale back your ask. And if that still doesn't work, you've already planted a seed. You can come back next year and try again. Perhaps the philosophy has changed. And as momentum continues to grow around this movement, then they might be more receptive at that point. So now I will turn it over to Steph, who will talk about how this actually works in the library. Steph's had a great example at High Plains Library District.
Yeah. Well, first I want to thank YALSA for having all three of us, and also Meg and Beth for including me in this presentation. I worked on this presentation with them, gosh, was it last year? Maybe farther back than, I know, it's been a while. But it is something I never get tired of talking about, because it has had such a positive impact. And I see that many other people have had the same experience. Once you eliminate those fines, you know, it just brings in so much more positive interaction with your patrons. So I do have a couple of quotes. After we initiated this, we did a staff survey to, you know, get some feedback from staff to see what they've noticed. And I have a couple of quotes here that are pretty reflective of what most people were saying. I mean, the comments that came back to me on a personal level. So the first comment is, since we eliminated fines, a shift has occurred so that now it is clear our priority is customer service. And the other comment was, or is, fines elimination has elevated us from the role of fine police to the role of free service providers. This is a much more positive role. And, you know, I think we can all relate to that. Any of us who have ever worked the front desk can relate to that, and probably this next slide. We'll just, in 10 years, he's going to be a teen. So I apologize, I don't have a teen on this one, but so we've all worked the front desk, and at some point you do have that patron who comes in, and a lot of times it's either a teen or an adult. But most of the experiences that I've had have been an adult on behalf of a teen or a child. And I have experienced everything from a reptilian visceral reaction that required every single tool in my conflict resolution toolbox, you know, all the way to just, you know, mildly begrudged payment with the parent turning to their kid and saying, well, that's it. You're not taking anything again. Either way, you know, they both have the same effect, both on the patrons and on us. You know, it doesn't feel good. So, so that was one of many factors that sort of drove us to our decision. Next slide, please. But before I talk about our process, for those who are unfamiliar with Colorado, the High Plains, and certainly Weld County, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about where we are and what we're like. We're about 30 miles northeast as the crow flies from Denver. And our service area, which you can see here, is more than 4,000 square miles, is largely what that photograph looks like. A lot of it is rural and agricultural. We do have some growing medium-sized towns. We have some, well, actually I can talk about growth in just a moment. But we have a lot of really small towns throughout our service area. Our population, as you can see there, is, well, when it was last reported in July of last year, the U.S. Census Bureau's Fact Finder had us at 300,633 residents, which makes our population density about 76 people per square mile. To put that in some kind of perspective, Denver is 4,044 people per square mile. So we have, you know, we are few and far between. Next slide, please. So it won't surprise you, with our population density being what it is, that Weld County is actually considered a book desert. I know we've probably heard the term food desert for places in some towns in the Central Valley, but book desert certainly applies in our case. There are very few resources for households to get access to books and materials unless they're purchasing them. They can go to the nearest town and go to a big box store, or they can purchase online, but there aren't libraries in close proximity necessarily. However, the public and school libraries do usually become the primary source for literacy-based programs and materials for all ages. For those people, if they are going to make the drive, they're going to drive to a library as opposed to driving to a box store and purchasing something, because most of these families in our rural communities are pretty strapped for cash. And, you know, we want to make sure that we're there and available for them. So compounding this issue of being a book desert, we are the fastest growing county in Colorado. And according to both our state demographers as well as US demographers, we are the 4th fastest growing county in the United States. So we're spread out, but we're also getting a lot of people very quickly. And we knew that when we decided to go fine-free. We knew that we needed to really put community first and start building these positive relationships. So when the spell paper came out, in 2015, we had several staff that said, hey, we really need to think about this. We really need to get on board. You know, early literacy is a focus for us, of course, as it is for most libraries. So we had staff recommend it to our then director, Janine Reed, who in turn took it to our board of directors. And at the time, you know, the spell paper focused mostly on early literacy, and that was also our focus at the time. We've since changed a little bit, and I can talk about that as well. But really, we wanted to build positive relationships and promote the early literacy efforts in our communities. And it was an easy sell to the board of directors. You know, focus on early literacy means getting more books in children's hands earlier and growing future readers and future library users. So that was an easy one. The other piece was to work really closely with finance and to look and assess just how much these fines were accounting for our overall revenue. And as Beth mentioned earlier, it really is less than 1%. For us, we were hovering around 0.9% of our overall revenue. So once we were able to show them the hard numbers in terms of, you know, what we would theoretically lose, it was a no-brainer. That was a really easy argument for us to make. But I do want to emphasize, work with your finance department. If you haven't already moved to a fines-free environment, if you are moving in that direction, work very closely with finance and try to really drill down those numbers, because you do have people who want that on boards a lot of the time. Okay, next slide, please. So our initial proposal was to eliminate just the fines on children's picture books and board books. So we took that to the board, and our board, who I definitely want to commend, looked at that and said, you know what, this is great, but we want to expand that. So let's expand it to everything except for specialty checkout items and Blu-rays, and Blu-rays and DVDs, which is what we did. Once we got their approval, which I think that came in 2015, in the late fall of 2015, we immediately had to go into developing a process for this. Fortunately, if you've gone fines free, you already know that the process is not incredibly labor intensive, but at least for the staff, not much changed for the staff other than being sources of information on this change. Most of our changes came in the form of our automated system. So we have our system set up. We're on Sierra. I don't know if anyone else is. But in our system, a reminder notice goes out 3 days in advance. It's automated through teleforms. I think we're teleforms, and we might be going back to telecirc, I'm not sure. But an automatic notice goes out 3 days prior. Once the due date comes and goes, 4 days later, they will get another notice. And then we go 27 days for a third notice. After that, at 45 days, we will send an invoice for the material. And then for the accounts that have been submitted to Unique, so that's the service that we use for collections. And I'm sure a lot of other people use them as well. So once they get to like 71, 79 days, we're not able to do too much to change things for them. But between that 45 days and the 71 days, if they actually bring back that item, even though they've been invoiced for it, they can bring back the item will come off of their account. If the item has been sent to Unique, then there is still a $10 amount on there, and that's something that is, you know, an outside entity that we're paying, so that one actually stays on there. And I'll talk a little bit more about the flexibility that we give our staff too in terms of waivers. In addition to changing our process and sort of extending the dates, we increased the amount that blocked an account from $5 to $7.50. We've kept it at that. Initially, you know, our focus was we really wanted to make sure that people had this extra wiggle room as we were changing processes. So these are the hows of what we did. We can go on to the next slide, I think. But if anyone has a question, please throw it in the chat.
Yeah, so there was one just about paper notices or electronic.
Ah, that is such a good question. At this point in time, our notifications are by phone and by email and by text if people opt in for text. Not so many people do that, but phone and email is what we do for our initial overdue notices, and same with holds. If somebody requested an item, they sign up for either phone or email notification at this point. They don't actually get something in paper unless they are billed for something. And you know, there were a myriad of reasons why we went that route. But the notifications was really a decision that was made when we switched to Sierra in 2014. So we just retained that piece. And I'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment as well. So once we switched over, so the effects of reducing our fines, you know, there are pluses and minuses to everything. In this case, we did see a slight decrease in fine revenue. We anticipated that. When I last looked at the financials that were given to me from our finance department, it looked like we would theoretically be hovering at about 0.75%, which isn't very much. So that's even less than, you know, the 0.9 that we were at when we went fines free. So it has had no impact, and at least that piece has had no impact. In terms of our debt collect services, sending accounts to Unique and what we pay Unique, that has gone up slightly. It's gone up by about $3,000 a year, based on looking at the last 5 years. We're probably about $3,000 more a year on average. But it was offset. So if you look at the financial savings, we were able to do away with our 3M payment plan and all of the swipers on our self-check machines, which had a two-part effect. One, it saved us money. But two, we were able to get rid of those swipers and just go to a square register. So we just have one iPad square register at the front desk of each of our libraries. And, you know, that's great for patrons too, because if they do have to pay something, it's just like going to the coffee shop. You know, every coffee house, you know, at least in Colorado, it seems like, has the old iPad. You swipe your card, you sign with your finger. I mean, they can pay cash as well. They don't have to learn another system. We used to get a lot of questions when people would want to pay at the self-checks. So it was kind of nice to get rid of those. We also transferred from Comprise technologies to just working with I for some of these processing, for the financial processing piece. And that's been a savings of about $13,000 so far. And who knows, you know, if Comprise charges more now, it might be more. Now, this is a big one for me. The staff time savings at 30 seconds per transaction. I could probably argue that it would be more like 45 seconds per transaction if you really look at the fact that some of these interactions that we were having, they not only took time, they would be, depending on the reaction of the patron, they could be really stressful for our staff, so much so that they wouldn't know what to do and would have to get a supervisor. So then you don't only have the staff person, you also have the supervisor coming out and working with the patron and trying to calm them down and whatever. So I would argue that we actually are saving more there. And then the drop in the number of money handling transactions has gone down so substantially. We're able to carry less cash up front. In general, you know, the staff are happier. In Sierra, we always have to log in every time we take cash. So, you know, it's just fairly cumbersome. So I would say all in all, I mean, we're saying that the money is neutral. From a supervisor perspective, I would say that maybe we're definitely coming out on top. Let's see, I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything here. Nope. There was another graphic that I originally had in our presentation that talked a little bit about return, you know, how quickly people return things. But as both Beth and Meg have pointed out, there was no change. People still bring things back. If for those late items, they still bring things back within a week of the due date. And then for those that are coming back, you know, 45 days late or whatnot, it's not any different than it was before. I mean, some people forget that they have books or whatever. And so there really hasn't been any change. So I think we can go to the next slide. Great. So this is what we still collect for in our district. If something is truly lost or damaged, we will collect for that. But we have a little bit of a rubric to help us decide whether we're going to charge someone for something. I bought a book last year. I bought a cookbook. It's a very nice cookbook. My husband spilled olive oil all over it, and I was the first person to check it out. So guess what? It was mine, which is fine. I don't mind. But if it was a book that, let's say it was a cookbook that had circulated, 50 times, if we've gotten our return on investment on an item, we are not very likely to charge someone for it. And of course, circumstances being circumstances, people get robbed, people have, good Lord, look at Tallahassee right now. All kinds of things can happen that are going to ruin materials. But yeah, we look closely at the ROI before we decide whether we're going to charge someone for something. Someone had asked about lost, when something actually gets set to lost. It would be around that 45-day period. That's how it automatically ages. So that's typically when it gets set to quote unquote replacement status. So it's lost at that point. Other things that we charge for are interlibrary loans, because we don't own those materials. So if those are late, they're $1 a day. So it's not a tiny fee, it's just enough to make sure that people want to bring it back. And then we also have specialty items. So all 5 of these items are things that we circulate, and they're pretty high ticket items, and they're in high demand. So those items are actually $20 a day if they're late, which is a lot. But because they're in such high demand and we have high turnover and they're expensive, that's pretty much where we are with those guys. Any questions so far? Am I missing anybody? I'm not really looking at the chat right now.
No,
okay,
you're good.
Great. So we can go to the next slide. And our impact. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody here has probably can echo this. 80 to 90% of our patrons are, we put mostly happy because, it's subjective, but based on my personal interactions and those that I've had the privilege of witnessing, what usually happens is you have that honest patron who comes up with their book or books and says, I was on vacation, I'm a couple days late, so you want to just let me know what I owe you. And you get to tell them, well, let me look at your account. It doesn't look like there's anything on there, you're good. And then if they ask the question, it's a nice opportunity to engage them in conversation and tell them about this change that we had made. They're usually very happy about it. I do have that 10% are a little bit skeptical. And usually if they're skeptical, it ties back to those talking points that Meg had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It usually has something to do with, well, don't you want people to be civically responsible? Or, what about my tax dollars? Why are my tax dollars being wasted in this way? So I would say refer back to those talking points. And, I have little scripts and things that I go through with my staff, just in case these issues come up. And then if my staff still doesn't feel comfortable having these conversations, then I have them. It's perfectly fine with me. So yeah, so folks, it's been very well received. The only thing that I would say with regards to implementing a process like this, and maybe you all have discovered this, is please train your staff to front load the information. When they issue a library card, make sure that they explain the process to the patron, to the new patron, because it's a little different than what we grew up with and than what most people grew up with. So just to be clear that, at 45 days, you'll probably get a notice, and that's going to be, probably maybe a substantial amount of money. It's always good to let them know in advance. All right, we can go to what is my second to the last slide. So these were the increases that we saw. As Meg pointed out, we did see an 8% increase in, I don't think for us it was juvenile borrowers, it was just the circulation. So we saw an increase in juvenile circulation, as well as a 16% increase in picture books and board books. And that was really the kicker for us, because at the time, again, we were focused on early literacy. So we really were really hoping anyways that we would see a nice jump there. Our circ figures are pretty substantial, so to see this kind of a jump was a good thing. It was impressive to us. So, so yeah, they did increase. I tried pulling YA numbers from that time period, and I apologize, I could not get them. Our data goes back to 2015 on an ongoing basis. So the numbers from 2014, they kept all of the media and the juvenile and the picture books, but they didn't have YA. So I'm just going to assume that there was an increase there as well. We can kick over to my final slide. And we have 2 more programs that we do on a regular basis. So the first is Food for Fines. We're in the middle of it right now. And it, you know, because it's right before the holidays, this goes over really well with people who have fines on their accounts. So for any canned food or any packaged food, they get $1 off of whatever fines and fees they have. The only thing we can't waive is that collections fee that comes from Unique, but everything else we can waive. And then amnesty for teens, as Beth pointed out, and this is great. So I just want to say, this was a couple of weeks ago, I had a young man come in. He was about 18. He was out of high school, and he had not been in the public library since he was a kid. But now that he was out of high school, you know, he wasn't going to be near a library on a regular basis. So he comes in, and he couldn't remember his library card number. So I, you know, asked birth date, name, and I looked him up, and he had more than $10 on his account. And I'm talking with him about this, and I said, you know, let me look, compare your birth date and look at the date on this. And I said, you know what, these were all accrued when you were a kid. You're like 11 years old when these were accrued. So I'm taking these off, clean slate, you know, just, you know, we'll go from there. And that's how we handle that amnesty for teens. It's not just, you know, once a teen turns 16 that the system automatically wipes it clean. We had hoped that that III would do that, but it won't do that. So we do it on an interaction by interaction basis, which for us actually has ended up turning out to be a really good thing, because we get to interact in a positive way with teens on this issue, and it alleviates that shame, you know, and then you get to talk about fines and fees and, you know, the fact that we got rid of them and how ridiculous they are and all of that. So yes, this has been a very popular and positive program. Does that mean amnesty for teens, including lost materials? If it's an item that has been lost, we don't necessarily treat a lost item any differently, I guess, than we would anything else. Because, you know, for example, in the case of this 18-year-old, you know, whatever was on there was from when he was a child and his parent brought him in, and those materials didn't get returned for whatever reason. If they had been lost items, I still would have waived them. That we don't, you know, at that point, we're talking 7 years, it wouldn't have made any difference. If it's, you know, just the year before and it's a lost item, we would still do the same thing. We just wipe the slate clean for them, which it might sound like it's a lot, but believe it or not, it's really not. Most of those cases, they're little kid books, so they're like $5.99 even if they're new. So does that answer your question? I'll just, yeah, if it does, you can just type that it does. We also empower all of our staff to waive fines at their discretion. Again, we have a rubric. You know, if something is brand new and has only circulated one time and somebody lost it, unfortunately, we'll have to charge them. I had a patron come in, they had 3 items, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but there was a long discussion. And so I came out and I took a look, and 2 of the items were purchased in 2007 and had circulations over 25. And so at that point, you know, the item is old enough and it has been checked out enough over a period of time that there's no reason to charge them for that. But the other item that was on there was new, and you can't get around that. And unfortunately, the new item was the really expensive of the 3. But patrons understand that, and I feel like just being honest with them and talking with them about that really helps. Just that transparency really seems to help foster positive relationships. So.
Sarah has a really interesting question about being in a consortium. Mm-hmm. So they do, if one system in a consortium charges fines, but the other doesn't, how does that work? You know, if people borrow materials across.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, we have something that originally that was going to be an issue for us. We thought it was going to be an issue. Our district is really unique. We have branch libraries and we have member libraries. So we're not quite a consortium. We're more of a blended family, if you will. I don't really know how else to describe us. But the district would set policies, and then the member libraries were usually municipal libraries. They are municipal libraries, and they could set their own policies. So if a book came back late, you know, they wanted to charge their amount, and, you know, so it created some friction. I won't lie to you. It definitely created some friction. But what we were able to do is, you know, just talk it through pretty much. When you're talking about a little bit bigger consortium, we have something in the state of Colorado called Prospector. And everybody in Prospector, and Beth, maybe you can talk about this. Are you familiar with Prospector at all? So Beth might be able to talk about this a little bit as well. But with Prospector, we now can borrow from anybody who is a quote-unquote prospector library in the state of Colorado. And there are quite a few of us, and many of them are large districts. I think at this point, most of our large districts are fines-free in the state of Colorado, so it's not that much of an issue. There are some municipalities that still charge. But if you borrow within this system, it's been agreed that if an item gets lost, it gets lost, and we just move on from there. Does that sound about right to you, Beth? Okay.
Yes, usually libraries that have gone fine-free still often, not always, but often still charge for interlibrary loan and cooperative arrangements like Prospector.
Yeah.
Carter's question, I'm sorry, I think we have time for one more question. And this is a big question for me too, is Carter is channeling my brain. So you have, I think it's specifically thinking about teens, is you have fine free and getting the word out, particularly for those teens or anyone who have a bad relationship with the library because of this, right? So how do we bring in the equity when people don't trust that they can go in clean slate? Because if you come in and you talk about the fines, which
sure
you were talking about, but what do you do to bring people in who are not trusting us at the moment?
Right. Well, I'll be honest with you. It seems like word of mouth really passes quickly through teens. But, you know, I mean, in that case, I would say reach out to your to those teachers who you know. When I was working at the Erie Public Library, actually prior to becoming an adult services librarian, I was a teen librarian. And so I had pretty close connections with the teachers at both the high school and the middle school, less so with the elementary school because I didn't quite work with that demographic. But anything that was happening at the library, if I felt that it impacted their students, I always let them know. I was in constant communication with them. So I don't know, everybody has a little bit different relationship with their schools, but I think that's one place that you can reach out to get the word out. And I'm sure you can, create some sort of publicity for it as well. But I understand, they don't, we're an institution. They don't trust institutions.
I would add to schools also other partners that you have, Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, wherever your teens hang out, that you can get the word out. Hang up flyers in where they hang out to spread the word.
And I was just telling Carter in the chat, if you look at that Google Doc, I've tried to capture the news stories. Particularly local newspapers love this policy change, and they'll come and visit you, and they'll I mean, not that teens are reading newspapers, but it's going to get out and their parents are going to hear about it. But it's you should really tap into that free publicity because it's something it's just a human interest story that reporters seem to like to cover.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another
Yeah,
way.
and I forgot to mention that, you know, before we actually transitioned to completely fines free, we did also, for that summer reading the year before, we were transitioning to Sierra. So we wanted to get rid of as many of the fines and fees that we had on there. And we had, so for any kid who registered for summer reading, they got a bookmark, which was the equivalent of a $1 waiver towards their fines and fees. And we would visit the schools to promote summer reading. So that was another thing that we did that helped, at least in the very beginning.
And this slide here shows a great example of creative marketing about ending fines. So definitely, as Meg said in the chat, look for examples. And we've got a lot in that spreadsheet and growing all of the time. So look, people have come up with some great marketing campaigns for letting people know that you've gotten rid of fines.
Well, thank you all. We are just about a little over time, but thank you, Meg, Steph, and Beth for facilitating this session. Lots of great information for everyone.
Yeah.
I will be sending out a follow-up tomorrow with the recording, the slides, the transcript, etc. And happy to have had you all here today. The next webinar is on November. Oh my gosh, I didn't look at the exact date, but I can tell you now on the topic of outcomes and assessment. So we'll be talking about how you demonstrate impact in your communities with the work you're doing within 14s. And that is on November 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your week.